Hello and Happy New Year. I thought I'd put together a sort of highlight reel of the best of the 2024 episodes, especially if you may have missed some of them. It's been a wonderful year for the Talkin' Appalachian podcast, complete with some pretty amazing guests. The first clip is from my interview on the campus of UVA-Wise in front of a live audience with Pulitzer-winning journalist Rick Bragg. Bragg is from Alabama, and he became one of my favorite writers when I discovered his memoirs, Ava's Man and All Over But the Shoutin', which tell family stories beginning with his grandparents. In this particular clip, he's retelling a story that his Aunt Nita recalls about the time his granddaddy ran over Clementine Ritter's head.
And all stories in my family are punctuated with the words, my God. So I said, my God. And she said, we all piled out of the truck and looked down, and Daddy had run over Clementine Ritter's head with his truck tire. And I said, my God. She said, yeah, hon, it was awful. You know, her head was all mushed up and all whomp-sided. And those of you who are not from the Deep South, whomp-sided is WHOMP-sided. And my God, what'd you do then? She said, well, Daddy picked her up and slung her back off in the weeds. My God. And I said, you didn't do anything? She said, no, Mama had supper done. I said, no, you didn't do anything. And she said, well, hon, we didn't have to. When we got home, we were eating supper, we looked outside, and here she come, staggering and weaving up in the yard. Her head was still all whomp-sided and always would be. And only then did she bother to tell me that Clem Ritter was a dog. I forgot your question, but I felt that story was worth getting in the public record. It's a keeper.
Yeah. The next clip is from an episode titled What Two Letters Written a Century Apart Can Tell Us About Dialect. The first letter was written by a Civil War soldier to his wife. Sadly, he would later die at Gettysburg. It's read by Brock Davidson, and the letter was written phonetically the way the soldier would have sounded back in 1862. That's what these old letters can reveal about spoken dialect from times when audio recording wasn't available.
February 17th, 1862, camp near Manassas Junction. Dear Martha, take my pen in hand to let you know that I am well at present. Hope when you get this may find you all well. I have nothing interesting to write to you. I think from your letter everything was getting along as well as I could expect. I was sorry to hear that your pigs was dying. I sent a little book home by Ben Clemens for the children. You wrote you didn't want me to drink too much. I don't expect to drink too much while I stay here. I haven't drank too much but once since I have been here. That was the second day of Christmas. I like to got in a fight. Feller struck me with tent pole. Chris was holding me and I couldn't get hold of him. I cussed him for everything I could think of. Never got past traveling. Never done nothing with me. I would whip him now if the law wasn't so tight. You needn't be uneasy. About me, I'll do the best I can. You must do the same. Girls may look out. Boys had a mighty Valentine drawn on the 14th February. I think some of the boys is getting very uneasy, afraid the girls won't wait for 'em. Here is so much marrying up there. There's a great many coming home on furlough. I want to come too, but I can't come yet, but every dog has his day. I reckon it'll be my day after a while. I must come to close, for it is about midnight. I'm very drowsy. I remain focused. You must write soon. Miller must write too. John B. Gregory to Martha J. Gregory and our children. Excuse my bad smelling. This yous remember me, whatever I may be. Bad dictator, slow scribe.
This next letter is read by Addie Hutchinson and was written in 1959 by my great-aunt Cordy, spelled Cordia, but was pronounced with a Y, and that's common around here with words ending in A. She, too, writes in her spoken dialect. She was sent from the only place she'd ever lived, Lee County, Virginia, to the Catawba Sanatorium in Roanoke to recover from symptoms of tuberculosis, and she's writing home to her parents and sisters and clearly very homesick.
Dearest mother and sister's brother, I will answer you all's letter I received this evening. I sure was worried for a while. I always get the letter in the morning, so I sure was worried till I got it this eve. I thought of everything. I hope you all are well. I'm feeling pretty well. Sometimes I get nervous. I tell the doctor everything that hurts me, and she don't seem to think it is anything bad. She say it ain't nothing to worry about, so I guess it's to be a healing. They don't never took my x-ray, yet I have been here 3 months of Saturday the 12th of September. I don't know when they will take it. I don't think I have the TB very bad, but you don't know how long you will have to stay here. I guess you will stay here till you get stout. I don't know. I feel pretty stout. Sometimes I get worried about getting to come home. I get so homesick I can't hardly stand it. But I can't help it. And Mother, you be sure and don't overdo yourself. You take care of yourself. It's about time to cut corn too, ain't it? And it won't be too long till potatoes will need digging. It is getting cold up here too. Ever since Sunday I have been laying under a blanket, a double yarn blanket and sheet, so it won't be long till it will frost. I might get to come home if I had someone to ask the doctor about me. She won't tell people much, but she would tell my people about me. I hope Blanche can get to come up here with me right away and can come in to see the doctor. She could see her in the morning. Maybe she'd tell I wasn't much bad off. I know I ain't. There are a girl from Blackwater up here, a Childress. She said sometimes she was so homesick she couldn't get her breath. Everybody is homesick, but when you get behind these walls, you can't get out till they get well, unless they will let you come home for a week, and you can stay if you want to. There have been several left to stay a week and never come back. If I had TB, I would have to stay up here all winter. I would come home to stay a week and not go back. I'm not a-going to stay here all winter. If I'm not well, I will get with somebody that lives down there and come home before I will. And if any of you was up here, you would be like me. If it wasn't so confining, it wouldn't be so bad. We patients have a pretty good time every night till 9 o'clock. And they close the doors and we can stay in our rooms till 9:30, and the light have to be turned out. But I burn a little wall light all night, so that's fine. I look for Blanche up here Sunday, but there ain't no use to look for her till I see her a-comin', are they? I sure hope I will get to come home before you have to grate tobacco. It don't feel like there's anything the matter with me. And has Bullet got to layin' in the house? I don't know if Bullet would know me or not, but guess she would. Is she as mean as ever to bark at people? And Mother, I've got some pretty cloth for all of us pretty dress, and I've got Hazel a dress and buttons to put on them. I would like to come home, but I have to stay here till they turn me loose. It's like the pen. But don't worry about me. I'll take care of myself till I see you all, and you believe me, I will never see this place again. From your daughter to Mother and all in God we trust.
When you compare these letters, it's easy to see pronunciations and grammar patterns that have not changed in a century. And that debunks any myth about vernacular dialect being random. It's truly rule-governed. And I explain all of this in more detail in the full episode. In March of 2024, we had the opportunity as a family to go to Ireland. And of course, if you know about Appalachia and settlers, you know that much of our language comes from the Scots-Irish. Here's a clip of an interview with our bus driver and phenomenal storyteller, John Fleming, about Pictish or Ogham writing, which is the root of the language. Now, something I saw a lot of in museums and imprinted on jewelry, Ogham writing, O-G-H-A-M. It is considered a primitive version of the Irish language, and it's a Pictish language. It's visual. You see it carved on stone monuments. It was also carved on wood, and in its simplest form, it has 4 sets of strokes or notches, and each set has 5 letters. giving it 20 letters. It's called a Pictish language because it was spoken in northern Scotland and then replaced by Gaelic in the 9th century. Known as, and I absolutely love this, the Celtic tree alphabet. Individual letters are associated with the names of various trees. Each letter corresponds to a specific tree or shrub. Here's what John had to say about
A guy back there across the way from me, bed and breakfast in Dingle, who was a jeweler, and he did what they call home writings on jewellery, and that was writings that were done back in the 5th and 6th century. There were lines that were drawn that represented letters in the alphabet. It's done in strokes, right? So you wrote with strokes.
And that's the Celtic, that's the
Celtic
roots of
around,
Irish.
Yes, it would be dating back 5th and 6th century.
And so I saw stone monuments in Dublin, in the museum in Dublin, the Archaeological Museum, with lots of inscriptions, these strokes, these Ogham strokes. And you see it in pieces of jewelry, in jewelry shops. The Burial Ground in the Woods is a two-parter, and this clip is from part 1. I interviewed Will Isom with Black in Appalachia about a cemetery in my granny's woods that he helped me to document and research. The family story says that the stones, which have no writing on them, belonged to enslaved people, but I had no more than that to go on. Eventually, we found some pieces of the puzzle, but it was what Will found from his own family that really made all of this worthwhile.
Yeah, first seeing that space, my first impression was the trek to get there, right? Like we're trekking in kind of this line, following you up the hill to the space, and so its position on the hill was the first thing I noticed, and my first impression. And then you don't immediately see the evidence of the cemetery until you kind of stop and look, and then it's like, oh, okay, there's a tombstone, there's a tombstone, there's a tombstone. Yeah, the kind of silence of the place. There wasn't any text on the stones, and so there wasn't anything to talk to you in that space except for, kind of the silence of the position of the cemetery.
Yeah, it is very silent, very peaceful.
Mm-hmm.
The stones were covered in what my granny called graveyard ivy.
And
I learned later that's vinca, and that's a common vine that you find in burial grounds. But yeah, they're like old teeth. They're different sizes. They're leaning. Some have fallen. Some have been placed back up against trees. So we really didn't know what to make of it. At first we thought there was some organization to the stones, and then we started to realize maybe that wasn't the case because so many trees had fallen. Right-of-way had been cut. This is on a hill, but near the road. Mm-hmm. So the story I had been told, my great-great-grandmother told my grandmother, she was the first to say that that's what it was. So the fact that I had a living descendant that remembered another living descendant who was actually in touch with the owners of the land. In the process of doing this research, you uncovered some things about your own family, didn't you?
I did, because one of the things that I like to say is you generally want a slaveholder to die, but you want a slaveholder to die before the end of the Civil War so that they may inventory their estate, and that inventory sometimes can include the names of enslaved people in their estate. And so while we were looking over, hell and high water, everything that we could find to try to find some information about who may be buried there. And I was looking through wills and estates for what was just called the Western District of Virginia, which was Lee County, I think probably would be Wise County, and Scott County, Virginia. They were all kind of lumped together. And I was just like going through every will and just looking for names. It wasn't indexed. And just so happened to to find my great-great-grandfather, Kelson Isom, and his enslavement in Gate City, Virginia. And so, for 20 years, we knew that he was born in slavery. We knew that he was from Virginia, but we didn't know where in Virginia. And lo and behold, there he was listed in the inventory of his slaveholder that died. And he was valued at $1,200. And his mother was listed in there. I think she was valued at like $100, which sounds, value on any human is terrible, but that is salt in the wound. But yeah, so through our searching all records for enslaved people in the region, I actually found my great-great-grandfather listed in those wills. And so I was able to break through that wall in doing our research.
My next highlight is one of my favorites, and that's an episode about the Cherokee language. I interviewed one of the directors of the documentary We Will Speak, Michael McDermott, about how the Cherokee people are fighting to keep their language alive. And you'll hear some of the clips of the documentary in this highlight.
It's the centerpiece of our identity. Everything that makes us Cherokee happens in the language as it should be. If we lose our language, then who are we?
It's like looking at a storm coming, black clouds coming. You can't outrun it. It's going to pass you. That's what's going to happen to the Cherokee language. Once we're gone, it's going to pass.
I would love to see true Native American history taught in the schools. There was probably a paragraph about the Trail of Tears.
Everybody's social studies book has a blurb about the Cherokees, and it's all about this removal period. We have 10,000 years of history, but it's all relegated to this 5-year period.
I think that the development of the syllabary historically is incredibly important to Cherokee Nation's story. Not just Cherokee Nation's story, but America's story, because that is the first language, the first written language, the first writing system that was developed on this continent.
We continued talking to folks there. We met some amazing folks, including Sean Duncan, who, if you've seen the film, is one of the main participants of the film, but he is also the co-director of the film.
Join this movement to preserve the language and teach it?
Yeah, definitely. I think that the youth and young people are a vital component to why the language is starting to rebound from the low points that, it might have been in even 5 years ago. And there's a lot of reasons for that, including what you mentioned about an interest in learning where you've come from your elders. That seems to be an intrinsic part of Cherokee culture that I was able to witness and see in action. But I also think that there is this veil that's being pulled back about why the language was taken from the generations before the current generation. Things like the internet and social media have really allowed communication, and there's not one perspective anymore. You can seek out truth in various methods, more so than just getting your perspective from a history book, which is, something that I grew up with. And, so much was left out of history books. It's only written by, the conquerors, right? My own knowledge, I have so many gaps, especially in Indigenous history. And that includes, the traumatic happenings, such as the boarding schools, which really is only a generation or two removed.
You cannot talk about language loss, and you cannot talk about the potential of a language going extinct for Cherokee people without talking about boarding schools. A lot of these schools were started by missionaries and then later taken over by the United States government. United States policies of Indian education really comes from this man, Richard H. Pratt. Richard H. Pratt was a Civil War veteran, and then he went out west to fight in the Indian Wars. He sees education as a means to civilization for Native Americans.
I couldn't even tell you when I learned to speak English, because I was the last one in my family that was sent to boarding school. And usually when everybody goes to boarding school, they lose their language.
Indian education, as far as the United States is concerned, really is a war tactic. They were going around and rounding up kids and taking them to boarding schools and hauling them off.
At this point, it's not like it's ancient history at all. But then you can trace back further and further the assimilation efforts by the government and the horrors of the Trail of Tears and everything like that. So I think that the youth are aware now that, these things were happening. The generations before, it seemed like a lot of the language not being passed on was as a means of protection because they themselves were persecuted for speaking Cherokee. So it was, a lot of times it felt like a means to quote unquote save the children from having to endure the hardships that they had to go through. And, that's understandable, right? But at the same time, the youth now crave the language that they weren't taught, a lot of them.
One of the most exciting episodes for me was interviewing Barbara Kingsolver, who won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature with her novel Demon Copperhead. The book explores the opioid epidemic in Southwest Virginia through the eyes of its narrator, a boy nicknamed Demon. The story is inspired by David Copperfield, and Barbara says she got the idea for the book as she sat at Charles Dickens' desk while staying at the inn that was his home. This is another two-parter that you don't want to miss if you haven't yet listened. It was especially interesting for me because the book is set in my native Lee County.
I've been waiting my whole life to write this book in a certain way. I had to get this old, this much gray hair, and more importantly, be this comfortable with myself and my Appalachian identity to embrace this project of trying to, the way I was seeing it in my mind before I wrote it, and when it was scaring the tar out of me, was I wanted to write the great Appalachian novel, because I have spent my whole life, I grew up in Kentucky, thought Kentucky was a fine place to be from, then went to college in Indiana and discovered I was a hillbilly, and everybody thought that I was stupid and backward and bigoted, and oh, look, you're wearing shoes, and it's not funny. And it goes on. It didn't end there. And for my whole life, I have encountered stereotypes about Appalachia and almost never see us as we really are, for better and for worse, but the good stuff about us especially, but also the context of us and how come we have this kind of unemployment? How come we have these problems? What's the history? Who did this to us? That whole big thing I wanted to write, but I was scared to write it. And this voice in my head kept saying, nobody wants to read that, Barbara. Nobody wants to read that. Well, it took me a long time to understand that was all those people all my life saying, but you're ridiculous, and to just face that and do it was, I had to get to, and I'm going to break this to you. Life gets better. And one of the great things about getting older is you give less of a damn about what people think of you, and you can be yourself. So that's the project. That's what I wanted to do, to tell the story of us. I grew up in Kentucky. I now live in Washington County on a farm, not in Abingdon. I live in Meadowview, which is outside of, it's very rural. I'm a rural person. I'm an Appalachian. I've lived many other places in the world, but none of them was home. I had to come home. Wherever else I was homesick for these mountains. So where would I've written several books now set in Appalachia, and I have always set them in small towns that were like real small towns, but I gave them a fake name. I invented, like Zebulon Mountain and Egg Fork in Prodigal Summer is not a real town. It's like any number of towns around where we live, but I didn't want to pick a real place for several reasons. One is that Like if I said something in Meadowview, Virginia, it's such a tiny town. I mean, all of Meadowview would fit in this building. I don't want it to become like a destination where literary tourists come look at, I don't want to change the character of a place like that. So, and also I don't want the people who live there to be looking and saying, oh, that's me, or that's my cow, or that's my, that's my truck. I don't want people to be, like trying to identify themselves because they're not right. I don't put real people or trucks or real cows into my book. So this was different. I chose Lee County because my starting point for this novel I knew was going to be the opioid epidemic. Because the way I see it, the history of Appalachia is many things, but it's also a long history of outside corporations coming in to exploit the resources, to harvest something valuable from our place, take it out, and leave a mess. So first it was the timber, then it was the coal for more than a century. And coal mining really did a lot to the culture of education here. I mean, it wasn't good. It wasn't positive. A lot because the coal companies basically owned these counties. They owned the courthouses, they owned the schools, the hospitals, they owned the stores. Some of them historically didn't even pay real money. They paid in scrip, which you had, like fake money that you had to take to their store and buy their stuff with their money. So the way I see it, and I wanted to put this all in a context in the story of a novel, and the way I see it is that the opioid epidemic it was just one more thing, one more corporate endeavor to harvest something, and in this case, they harvested our pain.
That'll do it for this episode of the Best of 2024. I hope you enjoyed these highlights. And if you want to support the podcast and get extra content, please subscribe over on Patreon or on Facebook. Thank you so much for listening, and remember in 2025 to keep talking Appalachian.